This is a continuing series of public forums on our budget process and what we can expect in fiscal year 10. And as many of you may know, and for those who don't, the Board of Selectmen in early December voted to put on, or exactly November actually, voted to sponsor a debt exclusion question for the May ballot. And that question is a question that would allow the town to exclude the debt associated with the Jacobs Middle School as well as several smaller capital projects, and the total amount of the debt exclusion is of $1.6 million. Today's presentation is really to talk about Proposition 2.5 and the override/debt exclusion process. Proposition 2.5, which was put in place back in 1982, limits the amount of revenue the city and town may raise from local property taxes each year to fund municipal operations. And this amount is known as the annual tax levy. The law, however, does allow that a city or town can increase tax revenues above this limit, but only with voter approval. And that's when you hear the term override or debt exclusion. That's exactly what is occurring there. It's a request to the general public, to the voting public, to go beyond what Proposition 2.5 allows under the law. So again, there are two key types of overrides. There's a general override, which is utilized for day-to-day operating expenses. And then there is a debt exclusion, which is associated with a particular capital project or capital type projects. So an override or debt exclusion will increase the community's tax levy limit. It becomes part of the base for calculating future years' limits, and it is a permanent increase onto your taxes. The purpose of an override is to provide funding for municipal expenses likely to reoccur and to continue into the future, such as annual, operating, and fixed costs. Okay, so that could be things, for instance, an override, typically you'll hear them associated. People will ask the community to fund an override to add 2 new police officers, to add additional funds to a school department. So they're for operating expenses that you expect to continue on an ongoing basis. Yes?
So then that's the general override.
That's a general override. Okay. And again, there are 2 types of questions. There is an override question and there is a debt exclusion. And a general override question is designed for day-to-day operating expenses. Now, what is going to be requested of the Hull voters in May is a debt exclusion, which is the other type of question because it is related and linked to debt that the community has incurred. The cost of building the Jacobs School, as well as indicated, several smaller projects. So a debt exclusion, and this is the slide for us, in the sense, because this is the question that will be asked. A debt exclusion increases the amount of tax revenues to be raised for a limited or temporary period of time in order to fund specific projects. Now the key here is temporary. What does that mean? That means that debt exclusion will extinguish itself automatically once the debt is paid for. So think about it along the lines of, I'll get to you 1 second, Cathleen. Think about it along the lines of the override is for day-to-day operating expenses and you're going to be using it for time immemorial. Whereas the debt exclusion is like you went out and you bought a car. Once the payments for that car have been made and you own the car completely, you don't continue sending a check each month to the bank. It stops. Same kind of concept. Cathleen Jeffrey.
Is this a 20-year exclusion for this one?
The debt associated, the amounts associated with the debt, the biggest hunk of it is pretty close to 20 years, and that's the Jacobs project. The smaller pieces, some of them expire as soon as 2 years out. But the vast majority of it will run pretty close to 20 years. The amount of an exclusion may be raised in addition to the community's levy limit. So again, it's raising your levy limit. It does not increase the levy limit nor become part of the base for calculating future. So you hold it outside of your calculation. So each year you do your annual tax levy limit of the 2.5%, and the amount of debt that is raised is held outside of that levy limit for calculation purposes, and each year that amount will diminish by a small amount as you're paying that debt off. So the highest tax impact for a debt exclusion is typically the first year because that's the highest, the year where you're paying the highest amount of principal and interest. And each year that amount diminishes by a little bit.